Today, I'm joined by Richard Hanania. He is the president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, the CSPI, an organization which supports and funds research on how ideology and policy contribute to scientific and social progress. He is also one of my favorite contrarians, a man that I often very strongly agree with and sometimes very strongly disagree with because that's essentially his function on the internet and everywhere. So I'm really happy to have him on. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Alex. Glad to be here.
Is contrarianism a calling? Is it something that you've gravitated towards since you were a wee child, or how did
Yeah.
you in
I
this?
mean, I don't like people always say words like contrarian, heterodox. I cringe a little bit. Not that you make me cringe, but when I hear those things, I think that people focus on the controversy rather than the substance of what a person believes. So I never set out and say I'm going to be contrarian, I'm going to be heterodox, I'm going to be different than other people. I try to think logically and think for myself, and just often I end up there. And as far as yeah, whether that's always sort of been a part of me, yeah, it has been. I mean, I think when I was young, it took a much less healthy direction in the sense that I really couldn't understand other people. I really couldn't get along with them. I didn't understand concepts like white lies or like bragging or like these small exaggerations, like the sort of the forms of dishonesty and sort of the games you have to play. It took me a really, really long time, not until I was like late teens or 20s to even be able to sort of comprehend that, have that sort of sink in. So then, that was a problem. That was sort of you could see that as a defect when I was younger. As I grew up and I sort of understood social relations a little better, I consciously tried to improve. I just got more experience. I think my sort of independent thinking has become more and more of a benefit. And, I think it helps me understand the world, helps me get an audience and get my voice out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting to be the guy who half of the internet is mad at, depending on the month or on it's there's a meme going around, the Carl Schmidt meme about the friend enemy distinction, and it seems like this is a distinction that you're um, willingly disregarding. Who
Yeah, I mean, I'm not running for office. I'm not leading a political movement now. So that gives me a little bit of freedom. I think we have too much of that. I think we have too much of people trying to fit in one side or the other, or tailoring their message to the audience. So yeah, why not do something different?
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're kind of outside of the game, and I think being in a think tank. This is your think tank, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Okay, so you've kind of willingly taken yourself out of the equation, and you're kind of a court philosopher of sorts,
Well,
or
yeah, I mean, but I still have sort of a foot in the mainstream, though. I mean, I publish still in, I was in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. I was in, I've been in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and I've been published in Newsweek. So I've, academic journals too. I've got books coming out. It's not just me and my think tank doing the thing. I still have connections out there. I just don't have to be, part of a political movement. I think still people want to hear from me, and I'm not isolating myself from any larger conversation.
yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to be ambiguous enough to be still, someone might still want to invite you, because the thing is, if you want to build a platform, usually, people do kind of go on the friend enemy distinction.
Oh
They
yeah, no, that's the easiest path. Somebody accused me like a few times. People have accused me of trying to like maximize my follower count. Like, no, like there are things that I talk about, and I know every single time I talk about them, I'm going to lose a lot of followers, and it happens every time. A lot of my followers are anti-vaxxers, they're Trumpists. I tell them they're stupid, and I say it again and again and again, and they unfollow me. I lose followers that week. Oh well, I could be quiet, and I would probably gain followers. But yeah, I'm interested in having a voice being out there. But no, maximizing followers or maximizing influence, is not the only goal.
You have an interesting theory about experts, that the experts out there aren't, they don't fulfill their promise in terms of the predictions that they return, and that's been the case in several recent events. And I think coronavirus has been pretty much one of these events. And
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the anti-vaxxers, or the vaccine curious, the vaccine reticent, the vaccine interested but not committed. Like I would probably consider myself one of these people. Um, kind of see that as a or have this reaction as a response to the abject failure of expertise, and not only the abject failure of expertise but also having it inform any sort of policy. Like even if we have certain scientific results related to how coronavirus acts, it's not really implemented in policy. So I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, you've written on this, but what's how do you how, do you have empathy for people like me who are not necessarily jumping on the vaccine bandwagon?
Well,
I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I think it's a great measure if you're in a risk category. I think I would take it if I was
yeah.
older.
Yeah, it's not a crazy. I don't think it's a crazy decision at your age and health, assuming you're healthy. It's not crazy. We are in a place where a lot of old fat people in America are not taking the vaccine, and that's why we have ridiculously high death rates that happen to be concentrated in Republican areas and Republican counties. And it's just a shame that the liberals are the only ones who care about these red staters killing themselves. It's really a failure of the conservative movement. But on the issue of expertise more generally, yeah, I mean, there's somebody gets a degree, they become a professor, or they become some kind of government bureaucrat, and what how do they get that position? Do they necessarily know more than you or know more than any other intelligent person? And there's no proof of that. An inventor who comes up with some kind of machine, or comes up with some kind of gadget, or somebody who makes a lot of money in a market, they've proven something. They've gone out in the real world and done something. Well, you become a professor, what, peer review, other people looking at your work and saying this is good work, and they got their position because they also passed some peer review and people said that that's a good work. That's a self-licking ice cream cone. So what Phil Tutlock, the great psychologist, did was he went out and he got a bunch of experts, and he mostly on geopolitical matters, and he said, forecast, like what's the GDP growth going to be of whatever country, what's the likelihood of war, what does this give me, numbers, give me percentages, so we can track it. And then he took some other people who were not experts in the field, but maybe smart people who were in other fields, and the experts who were predicting things in their own field didn't do any better. So what does that tell you? The whole concept of expertise is sort of fake. Now, people can take that and they could say, well, I can't believe anything anyone says. And it is a problem, because just because someone is an expert doesn't mean they know anything. And so, I mean, if people are sort of confused about what to do, I mean, I would suggest finding people who, because there are super forecasters, there are people who consistently predict things well, and they tend to have certain traits in common. They tend to be people who think, they tend to be people who are not very partisan in their thinking. They're not very attached to the Democrats being right or the Republicans being right. They're people who think in statistical terms. They don't ignore base rates. If the GDP growth has been 3% for the last 20 years, you don't predict it's going to be 20% or minus 20% the next year. That's probably not a good prediction. And people often get attention for making these, crazy predictions about wide variation of norms, like there's going to be a civil war or there's going to be a collapse of China. You hear these things all the time. They're not very likely, because such things don't happen very often. So I would suggest following people like that. But you can't just say, what you can't do is just say, I don't trust the experts at all, because look, you still trust the experts. You still get on the plane. You still wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. I mean, they lied to me about so many things. Well, they also told you that the polio vaccine works, and the establishment also told you that the measles, measles, mumps, and rubella, and that stuff worked too. So sometimes they were
Yeah.
right. And so just saying we're not going to trust them, that doesn't really work either.
Yeah, I think the fear here is that there's been a marked decline in the trustworthiness of experts recently, or at least that's the perception. For different reasons. I feel like, especially in America, where essentially all the expertise comes from, there's so much polarization, there's so much partisanship that these are like two poles that pull the narrative towards them, and they also pull the experts because they have kind of a power gravity around them as well. So,
Mhm.
the source is tainted, at least it feels to me, and that's the source where all the expertise, trickles down, even to backwater places like Romania, where I am. So, that's at least to me, that's why. I don't mistrust expertise on principle, but it feels like this is a time where there is an extra reason to be stroking your chin a little bit more when someone makes a big pronouncement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I feel like the track records of vaccines and human history are very, very good. It's not like there's some like anti-racist angle to vaccines. So it's not like when they tell you BLM, protests are okay, but other kind of protests are not okay. You could see why that's nonsense. Yes, but generally you're right. It's very concerning. It's sort of like in the communist world, which the ex-communist world, which you live in, where everything had to be socialist something, right? You had socialist literature and socialist architecture, and socialist, whatever genetics was shaped by Lysenkoism and all this other things in the Soviet Union. And you had that same thing today. I think in the last 5, 10 years, particularly in the US, everything is about wokeness, identity politics, racism. People give it different terms, but concern with racism, sexism. It's become everything. It's become epidemiology. It's become anthropology. It's become anything you could think of has this feminism and this race component. And yeah, it's very disturbing. It's sort of a total. It's a sort of it's totalizing. I mean, it just completely imbues imbues everything that it touches. I mean, I remember the night growing up in the 1990s in the US. I mean, the late night comics weren't known for being political. They were known for being sort of center of the road, and Republicans and Democrats could both laugh at their jokes, and even the audience was fine with that. Like the audience wouldn't aggressively attack them if they weren't left wing enough. And it's just crazy where we've gone, where everything's been politicized in this very strange direction.
Yeah, this is another thing that I wanted to discuss with you because another one of your hypotheses is essentially kind of a theory of power, at least a theory of power in the last, let's say, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, I think by now. It's, the ascendancy of liberalism. And um, you kind of, your theory, as far as I understand it, is that, the wokeness that we see is essentially law. And it has been law in the US for a long
Yeah.
time, essentially civil rights law. But and I agree with that. But it feels to me like that's the kind of the crystallized version of it. Like, why was civil rights law so aggressively imposed at that time, and kind of why has it morphed? Like, what is your theory of power? Like, why has liberalism gotten to this point?
Yeah, it's a good question. Nobody's asked me that question. Why civil rights sort of became the motivating force in American policy. But look, the American history, issues surrounding African Americans, Black people, have been there from the beginning, and they've just been a fundamental divide. So this is something very deep in the United States. Obviously, we had slavery. We had parts of the country their entire economy was based on slavery, and we fought a civil war over it. After the Civil War, there was a big issue about how much to give power back to white Southerners and how much to try to force, kind of equal vision of equality onto them. So this question has always been there, just been very very fundamental. And in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s, one side won, right? One side won pretty decisively, got the legal changes they wanted. Things like anti-discrimination laws. I mean, there were people who wanted it back after the Civil War. In one case, the Supreme Court struck it down. They said it's unconstitutional because we still have private property rights in this country. But they overcame all those oppositions. The Roosevelt administration through the New Deal, and their other policies. They sort of expanded government power. They sort of set the terms of this, where these constitutional objections weren't really taken seriously anymore. So in the 1960s, you get the Civil Rights Act. So it's just a very emotional, powerful thing. People felt bad for Black people. They felt guilty over American history, and they wanted to equalize outcomes, right? And what happened was you started getting what happened in the 1960s, directly afterwards. I mean, you get this exploding crime rate, you get these problems in the inner cities, you get out of work wedlock birth rates getting up. It's not only do you not achieve equality on some measures, things for Black people get worse, and we've had no answer to this in the United States, and so it's been sort of this problem that everyone makes everyone uncomfortable. And the answer has been, well, the discrimination is still there, the racism is still there. It's just a little bit better hidden. It's more systemic. If you disprove racism in one area, if you show, well, okay, the reason that Black people don't get loans, approved at the same rate is because they might not have as much credit. Then you take a step back and you say, well, the history is the reason they don't have much credit. So wherever you argue with them, they can always go one step back and say, this is the racism. This is the start. And so, and the woman, the women's movement, I think, and later LGBTQ, as they call it. I mean, this all sort of, I think it just reason from analogy. It just was sort of piggyback on the black issue. And then immigrants, people weren't thinking about that during, the Civil Rights Act, even though they were passing a law on immigration. It's funny because people don't know that the way sex got into the Civil Rights Act was somebody was trying to kill it. They were trying to say it's so absurd a society where we didn't discriminate between men and women. Let's just put sex in there, and then we can kill the stuff, and then we won't get a Civil Rights Act based on race. So the original intent of this was just like, haha, this is just like this is going to destroy the bill, and it ended up being real. And then the women's movement came, and we've just been expanding to victim groups ever since. But yeah, I think I think the problem with the difficulties blacks have faced in America is sort of the sort of root cause of all this and in our history. People have like philosophical explanations, like, oh, it's because of Puritanism or it's because of the Frankfurt School. I think that's a little too complicated. It's trying to be a little too sophisticated. I think it's just simple people. They recognized we treated black people badly in this country. They felt bad about it. They wanted to do something about it, and things sort of took off from there.
Yeah, there's a kind of a common theory that I think I subscribe to as well now, kind of in our spaces, is that essentially everyone is liberal, but the liberals, I mean, the progressives are really liberal, and the conservatives are kind of liberal. So that's why they essentially can't form a powerful opposition to something they essentially agree with in principle. The idea that there is a certain type of progress. Maybe they don't agree with that, because one thing that we probably agree on is that the conservatives are laughably ineffective, and they have been laughably ineffective for decades upon decades since the civil rights era. Um,
Mhm.
do you subscribe to this in some way? I mean, it seems like I think you mentioned that in one of your articles that it's pretty strange that the best thing that the conservatives can come up with is talk radio is
Yeah.
riling up their constituencies with all sorts of new woke anecdotes and building a Patreon or things like that. So I don't know what's your feeling about this theory.
Yeah, I think that whether there is so there's people say that American politics is between different kinds of liberalism, and I think that's true. But I think what's happened with conservatives in America is they don't even stand up for the old tradition of liberalism, right? That they've gone along in a sort of uncomfortable and weak but sometimes enthusiastic way with sort of the civil rights resolution. So it's a liberal idea. I think liberal in the way the term is traditionally understood to say private property is very important. These anti-discrimination laws, they go too far. No Republican does that. Nobody in conservative media really does that. So like sometimes people say libertarians are the problem. I respect libertarians a little bit more than conservatives because they do sometimes have a sort of principled stand on these things. And if you took a principled stand for private property, a lot of the civil rights stuff, which is about violating property, violating the freedom of association, a lot of that stuff, at least what government's doing, uh, goes away. But yeah, I mean, the larger problem with the conservative movement is they don't have a story about what happened in the 1960s, right? They'll say Democrats, Republicans are the party of civil rights. It's funny. It's technically true. Republicans voted more for the Civil Rights Act, but what happened was all the Southern Democrats who voted against civil rights left and became Republicans over the Civil Rights Act. So the Republicans were the Republican nominee in 1964 was Barry Goldwater, who was opposed to the Civil Rights Act, right? And that was sort of the godfather, intellectual godfather, conservative movement. I mean, Ronald Reagan was also skeptical of the civil rights movement, who they love. So the entire history, the story that conservatives told themselves is just a complete lie because they don't want to challenge the broader civil rights narrative. They want to be in that tradition of, there was Lincoln and then there was Martin Luther King, and they want to take credit for it, which they can't take credit for. They can't take credit for. I mean, that's just absurd. And no intelligent person is fooled by this. And so they don't really have they don't really have a coherent story that makes sense, that tells you where the conservative movement's been and where it actually disagrees with liberalism. It's just not there, and so they've been just sort of going along with these trends for the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah, because essentially what their proposal is a weird concept of equality of opportunity, which Has been tried, I think, in certain ways, or at least, that's ostensibly what's been tried, but it hasn't really worked. So they keep pushing that and saying, "Okay, we're just gonna have to do this again." And it's I think that's the best thing that they have in their hand. Like it's pushing equality of opportunity again and again and again. And I think that's why the progressives are winning because it's obviously true that they're whatever variant you try, there's no such thing as equality of opportunity. If you really take the
Yeah.
magnifying glass to it, there is no such thing. So
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, because we have parents and we have families, and they give us, yeah. So conservatives believe in the family too, but then they also believe in the equality of opportunity. Well, how does that work? Because if your parents are drug addicts and mine are, did everything to give me everything in life, we're not going to have equality of opportunity. But if we have family, we're going to have these differences between people. So I think you're right. The idea of equality of opportunity is itself sort of incoherent as much as equality of outcome.
yeah. It's a strange thing to be a GOP conservative at this point, but I do think there's been a movement in people trying to maybe take a little bit more of a illiberal angle on things, or at least they're a bit more they're a bit happier to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, these are our principles. We're going to go after this very specific thing. I mean, very specific, more specific than not specific at all, which is what the kind of the principled, old school fusionist conservatism was about. So I'm curious, do you think there is a new breed of conservative on the horizon, like these, DeSantis, or the the more internet popular variant of conservatives, people who are a bit more brawny, I think.
I think they're okay. So let me. It's interesting because there's Trump, and it's just such a Trump is just a thing by himself.
Mhm.
And there is sort of a difference here in that there's like, if you look at what conservatism was, or the Republican establishment, what they were 20 to 40 years ago, a lot of times they were moving forward, quote unquote forward, on civil rights, more towards wokeness. So this Nixon signed the executive order to get affirmative action in the federal government. George H.W. Bush signed the Civil Rights Act of, I think, 91, which expanded some of these so-called protections. And what you're seeing with the conservative movement is, I think you're seeing at least less of that. They're not going to go along with the expansion. So, and even they'll roll back some stuff. So Trump, for example, on some of the trans bathroom stuff for the kids in school, they rolled that back a little bit. It was tough with it as administration. Jeff Sessions, convinced him to do it. And then there's other stuff too, like so I think a DeSantis administration would be pretty hard on that stuff. What the executive can do. At the same time, during the Trump administration, there was a Supreme Court case that basically wrote gender theory into American law. It was called Bostock, said you couldn't fire someone for being gay or transgender, and this is just another expansion of the Civil Rights Act. And two conservative justices, went along with it. So I think that was probably the most radical thing that was done on the social issues front during the Trump administration, sort of his fault. So I mean, he pointed to one of those justices. There was no movement on like affirmative action, things like that. There's some stuff like they would stop going after local police for so-called racism just because they arrested people of this race or that, and they would stop. They would not even stop, but be less likely to go after like school districts for disciplining kids of different. All this stuff is wokeness. And so there is, I think, a little bit more, come a little bit of a way since Nixon and George H.W. Bush, and that there is some kind of pushback to the stuff when Republicans are in office. There is no grander vision of how to roll back wokeness. The best case scenario you're going to get for the Republican administration is they're going to sort of, things will move maybe incrementally slower in a woke direction. And actually, it's probably going to get overwhelmed by the fact that there's a cultural backlash to when a conservative is in office. So Trump, I think the fact that he made all educated people this woke, overwhelmed any policy that he did, even if his policy might have been a few steps away from wokeness. So yeah, I don't think conservatives are thinking about these things very carefully. I mean, me just bringing up civil rights law. I mean, there's people who've talked about this. I mean, like Chris Caldwell, but it's really should be the focus of what you're talking about when you're talking about wokeness. And no, no politician that I've seen has really, taken this mantle and say, I'm going to do something about civil rights law or think about them in a way. They're introducing bills like Marco Rubio introduced a bill there to say, you could sue your corporations if they're too woke. I mean, this stuff like this is a joke. I mean, it's a way to get, retweets and donations and followers and whatever. There's this talk radio sort of aspect to it all. This kind of just being very online, trying to own the libs, and there's much fewer serious people. I mean, the left has many more serious people in the sense that they want to change the world. They'll dedicate their life into going into nonprofit, having a theory of legal change, going to sue the right person to sue and present the right legal theory, not being on Twitter or arguing with people or trying to own the other side, but actually doing the hard work on a daily basis. There's just a lot more people on the left who are like that, and that's a problem for conservatives.
Yeah. Do you think that banning critical race theory will have its intended effect, or if that, because it seems like this is the first time someone does something that looks effective, or it has
Well, I mean,
actually happened. I don't know in terms of the legal level, how it's going
you
to be
know,
implemented. Who is actually going to
uh,
enforce this law is a different question.
well, I don't know if you've been paying attention to American politics for long enough to know this, but like 8 or 10 years ago, there were all these laws passed at the state level that we're going to ban Sharia law. And so, like, okay, so Oklahoma now is not governed by Sharia law because 10 years ago they passed this law, and it's funny because it was like such a thing that, like you said, to get on the news, and obviously there was no Sharia law threat in all these states. And I don't know if they got struck down by the courts or they're still on the books, but I mean they just don't matter. But critical race theory, I mean, it's a little more serious than that. I mean, I mean, people did talk about when Trump was in office, when he did the critical race theory executive order, and I think the federal government is the real power here. I think the state is a bit overrated. When he did his executive order, because Rufo got on Tucker, and this was like I don't know 6 months before the presidency was over, they were talking about like these people were getting their they were on Twitter saying my contract, I had a contract to go do this for the government, this trading, and it got canceled. A chilling effect. That's what you want, a chilling effect on the other side. That's what civil rights did for conservatism. So you want a chilling effect to the other side. You don't want to be liberal and just give them the best opportunity to make their argument. Ideally, maybe you want that, but that's not the way the real world works. The real world works is it's going to tilt one way or the next or the other way, and then somebody is going to be chilled because somebody's going to be on the wrong side of whichever direction we're moving in. So I thought that was serious, and I think it was an example of now Trump didn't do this in a comprehensive way. Um, and it was at the end of the administration. So like the stuff that like a smart leader who was focused on this and who started from the beginning of his administration and really focused on this stuff, I think could make a difference at the federal level. At the state level, not teaching critical race theory. I mean, it's fine. I'm not opposed to it. I don't like the argument people say, oh, it's against freedom. I mean, look, it's a government school. A government school, the curriculum is set by government. Is it the legislator? Is it the school board? Whatever. It's government. It is a government institution. They're going to teach some things and they're not going to teach other things. So if you say critical race theory is bad, then go ahead, ban teaching critical race theory. Um, and at the margin, maybe it'll make things a little bit better, but it's still the same people who thought critical race theory was a good idea in the first place who have access to your kids all day. And I think the politics of the school boards, of the education industry, of public school teachers, I think that's going to continue dominating what kids are taught. You can't micromanage these things. It's about who has institutional power, and this doesn't change that.
Yeah. How optimistic are you, or how much do you think this is possible for people to actually exit from the mainstream, the public school system, the kind of these institutions that are permeated with people who will in some way teach critical race theory or race something to your children, even if it is banned. So is there a possibility of kind of splitting?
Sure. I mean, like so there's, I think something like 10 or 15% of kids already go to either private schools or they're homeschooled. So there is a lot of people who have checked out of the public school system. Now, others probably would if they could afford it. And so what the Republicans often do at the state level is they try to give money directly to parents, give them vouchers, and the teachers unions fight them tooth and nail. Why do they fight them tooth and nail? Because they know that a lot of people would choose not to go to the to go to public school. So I think things can be done here. Now, if you look at the school choice is like an old conservative idea, but if you look at actually the numbers, and there's a guy named Corey D'Angelo who I follow on Twitter and who writes about this. You look at like his organization, they did a report and they showed the number of kids who became eligible. So like some governor will say, I signed a bill to expand school choice, and it'll cover like 1% of the population or something. What conservatives have done on the school issue, they've talked a lot about it. The thing is, these things are politically hard. I mean, the people are not with you. If you really want to defund public education, you're going to get a massive electoral backlash because most people are not like sitting around worried about wokeness all day. They're basically just people watching TV, and anything that seems radical is going to anger them. And if you take money away from the public schools, it's going to anger them. Maybe that's going to happen. Sometimes you need people who are either can make the case or are willing to take the political the consequences, willing to lose an election or two to actually change things. So in theory, things can be done. It's not like if you had, a smart conservative movement, a smart anti woke movement, there aren't like places where you can take away the left's power. It's just very politically difficult. You need politicians who are a little bit brave, or you need activist movement or or an intellectual sort of establishment that holds politicians accountable, right? That doesn't just clap if they introduce some bill. That doesn't mean anything. That's not going to do anything. But they're actually smart enough to sit there and think about who could be doing more and what could they be doing more on, and then hold them accountable for that. So I don't see that, but in theory, it could happen.
Yeah, that's a kind of a hopeful message for the people attempting that. You also have another interesting theory about the feminization of politics and the feminization of the public space in general. And I feel like coronavirus policy seems to be like the big thing that's happened lately that is probably, I don't know, the crowning achievement of safetyism.
Yeah.
In many ways. So, what led to this point? Like, how is it just women entering the workforce, influencing policy? Giving women the vote was that the terrible thing?
I mean, yeah, all of that must have. I mean, all of that must have had a role to play in the feminization of society. I mean, the women vote thing has been around for a long time. So I don't know if that's that can be blamed for more recent developments. But I think that this interacted with the civil rights stuff we talked about earlier. So if you look at human resources managers, who are sort of the commissars of sort of the civil rights bureaucracy, the number of women are overwhelming. I mean, it's something like I have the chart in my Substack on woke institutions, just civil rights law. I think it's like something like 60 or 70%. So women are running these things. I mean, women are overrepresented in things like education in the education industry. So like the teachers unions, and then the teachers teaching your kids are women, and so and they have a place to they have I don't know if they're overrepresented in journalism, but there's a lot of women in journalism, right? Women are underrepresented in things like STEM and like entrepreneurship and self-made millionaires and billionaires. But that's not really that's not really the pressure points that are sort of shaping the culture. I think our culture is being more shaped by the education industry, human resources, government bureaucracy, and these are all places where women, have more of an aptitude or more of an interest in going into. And yeah, I think that a lot of our culture reflects that. That means we're going overboard on safetyism. We're not taking the consideration of not just the threat of something bad happening, but the cost and time and convenience and money and just normal functioning of a lot of these COVID restrictions, um, and other things. And then in other areas too, about prioritizing feelings over what's true or what actually works. Yeah, I think we see it everywhere.
Yeah, is there a political way to roll this back?
No, not really. I mean, there's a cultural way. I mean, in the sense that if religion spreads and eventually the Amish are going to make up like 80% of America, in like 100 years because they have like 8 kids each. Um, and so when you have, when you have more religious people going into politics, just naturally sort of they form families and they tend to be traditional kinds of families because that's what tends to work. And then you just get fewer women in places. But if you roll back to civil rights, bureaucracy and this stuff, you'd get fewer women in positions of power and influence too. So that's sort of the bonus of doing that. But it's mostly cultural, and yeah, I think secularization and having nothing that sort of encourages family formation to replace it has sort of made the sexes a little more interchangeable than they otherwise would be, and so you get this feminization of society.
Yeah, I'm curious what your theory is around the fact that we're kind of in a demographic slump, if not on a very steep trajectory downward in the West. What do you think the main factor is there? Like what?
I read a fascinating blog post, a series of blog posts by Anatoly Karlin. He's a guy you can find on Twitter, and his argument. I mean, and I've liked this so much that I want to actually dig a little deeper into the data. But basically, there was there basically that all throughout human history there wasn't really selection for wanting children. There was more just selection for wanting to have sex. And what happened was a few places pretty early. So when that happens, it stops happening, and you have people having a right to choose, or people basically being a little more free because of technology or because of economic development or culture or whatever. You get birth rates collapsing. And basically, but what happens is evolution moves very fast when you're selecting on only one thing, and so that turns around eventually. And so what's happening? There's some evidence to suggest this is that if you look at like places that had their birth rates fall early, and this is Scandinavia, this is Great Britain, and this is France, they have higher birth rates today. So those are the ones with the total fertility rate of 2 or close to it within Europe. While East Asia, Eastern Europe, these were places that had very high fertility until pretty recently. And so in the last few years, these places, even though they're in some ways more conservative, Eastern Europe and East Asia is more conservative than Western Europe. So that sort of goes against the idea that it's of the cultural thing. And so they haven't gone through this evolutionary process. I think there's a lot to that. If you look within the U.S., or other countries too. Religious people have more kids within a country. I think this will solve itself just because exponential growth is a really really fast thing. I mean, if you're selecting for people who are having 8 kids each, and each of them is having 8 kids each, even if you lose, 2, 3 to each generation, you lose half of them to go out in the broader culture. They're going to reshape the demographics, and it seems like it's not much until suddenly it is. That's how exponential growth works. Eric Kaufman doesn't go into the evolutionary theory behind it, but just talks about the sort of the numbers game. And in his book, "Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?" And you just do the basic calculations, and they're pretty fast. So yeah, I think this is something that it's deep as far as people's choices. I think it will reverse itself everywhere eventually. I mean, I think it's basically as certain as anything can be. Not in 20, 30 years, but 50 to 100 years. I mean, this will solve itself. And so yeah, there's a lot to this. They're doing very interesting things in China. I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen. I mean, they're cutting back on the education industry. A lot of times when you try to force people to have uh, more kids, it doesn't work. Now China is an unusually competent government, and a government with an unusual amount of power and able to affect its will on the population, so it could be different. We'll see, but this is going to be a fascinating one of the things in the world I'll be most interested in watching in the next 10, 20 years. Because according to Carlin's theory, China, very recently got its birth rate low. So it should be nearly impossible, but they have a government that's not like other governments. So we'll see what happens.
Are there any policies that are being proposed now, or are you just kind of convinced that if anyone can do it, they can do it?
Well, I mean, no, like what I would propose. I mean, no, I don't think there. I mean, look, yeah, if you want to subsidize, childbearing, I think if you want to, uh, it probably helps on the margin. If you have a more conservative culture, it probably helps on the margin, which, I talk about through, fighting these evil ideas that have, gotten through the school system and elsewhere. Um, do I think that there is a straightforward way to get us from, in a country like America or like in Western Europe rather than like in, say, China? Like, is there a realistic way to get the birth rate up by a lot as far as policy goes? I don't know. I don't think so. I've become a little bit more of just pessimistic on that front. I think sort of the trends are what they are.
Yeah, I believe that too, and I think it is kind of deeply cultural. It's a lot of people say, okay, politics is material. People mostly care about their self interest. I think the issue with children, though, it is much more expensive. It is a terrible hit to your standard of living. Obviously, I do think it's still cultural. Like I mean, I used to work in central London with people making a lot of money, spending it on a lot of things, who were 30 something years old, could have spent it on a child. They didn't.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous. You look at, like, okay, so who has the highest birth rate in the world? It's like countries like Niger, things like the Congo. It's not because the birth rate is, because children are more affordable in those places. We were poor. I mean, America was poor. Europe was poorer 30, 40 years ago. People had more kids. So yeah, I think when people like, I don't like sort of the generational identity politics where they're like, oh, you had it so easy, you could have kids, but now it's so expensive. That's nonsense. If anything, it's easier today, and people just don't want to do it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's tied to optionality. People are just used to having
Yeah.
comfortable
Well, I
life.
mean, one thing I'm really big on is just it's not just that education is liberal or it has these political bias. I think education in itself is a mistake. I think having people spend so much of their lives, men and women, spending so much of their lives in a classroom where they don't really learn anything practical, they're just jumping through hoops. That's a problem. So, if you're supposed to go to school until you're 22, just, if you're upper class, that's expected. And then sometimes you're going to go, 5 years graduate school, or you're just going to start your career. Yeah, that's cutting into your time that you have to form a family. So yeah, I think there's 20 great reasons to reduce the amount of education in society, and that's one of them.
Yeah, yeah, and the fact that education has a very limited marginal benefit after a certain point, especially
Yeah, so yeah.
more people in. It's like OnlyFans for your brain. You don't want everyone on the platform. So, you also and opened a can of worms recently in a very related subject, eugenics, or what people understood this as being eugenics. I mean, you stated essentially a fact that if you're going to have selective abortions. Preponderantly in one part of the country rather than in another one, there's going to be an imbalance in how many people with Down syndrome or maybe other congenital diseases.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, people kind of blew a gasket over that. I mean, I'm personally I'm not pro-abortion. I'm anti-abortion. Obviously, I think it's a nuanced subject, but people really took it to mean that Down syndrome people are less valuable and you're anti those people. And to me, it was just a case study in how people can really take something and filter it through their lens and really really yeah, blow a gasket about it.
Yeah, I think people are insecure about their books because what I said was basically a factually correct statement, right? If you have one area of the country or one part of the world where a lot of people are choosing to get abortions when they get a Down syndrome diagnosis, and other places where they're not, they're going to have big differences in rate of certain diseases and disorders and handicaps. I mean, that's just an obvious fact. And then people dislike this implication of their belief, but that's the implication of the belief. So there's a lot of places in Europe, a lot of places where people are more likely to abort their children after such a diagnosis, and those places tend to have lower rates of those disorders. So it's an observable fact about the world. When people even people in like conservative areas, when they do have the information, they tend to make the same choices as they do in Iceland or they do in Europe. And some people have a strong religious belief, obviously, and they don't do that. I mean, that's clear. What's going on is that they're taking this very minority position and trying, or at least a position that a lot of people will not will not live up to in their own lives, and they're trying to make it law. And so that's a problem. But yeah, I don't think it's controversial to say, what the implications of someone's beliefs are, and sometimes, they're upset when you tell them that.
Yeah, I think it's the interesting part about the reaction and the tweet was the fact that you state that 80% of people tend to make that decision. But the reaction was almost, completely like, okay, either you shouldn't talk about this, or why did you mention this particular fact, or to me, it was a kind of a case study in how a nuclear tweet is formed. It's kind of based
Well,
on.
what's interesting is because it's actually a case of where conservatives have been a little bit successful. It's when they've behaved like the left. The fact that they will go after people, and they're so crazy about this issue, and they're using even the same arguments. They're talking about eugenics and not racism in this case, but like you being like a bad person because you think some people are better than this is a liberal playbook, and the fact that it's such an overwhelmingly female, like the pro-life movement on the right is like so overwhelmingly female. So you have all these, I was very interested to see sort of the similarities, right, between wokeness and the pro-life movement. I think there's a lot there, and there's a reason that both of these have been successful, relatively successful in modern America. The pro-life movement, not as much as wokeness, but I mean, impressive given how little support they have among elites and elite institutions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's always surprising to people on the left, especially progressives, to understand that the most anti-abortion people tend to be women. I think having gone through pregnancy, it really does kind of change you, and especially if you have kind of a spiritual um, layer to your existence. It does kind of
Mhm.
it becomes a completely different issue, and I kind of started to change in my position, through the years, and now, yeah, I can understand why. I definitely understand, but I also understand my previous position, and then understand that this is a complex issue. And also being Romanian, we were talking before about what pro-natalist programs work. Well, we had a very pro-natalist
Yeah.
program in Romania, and working, it probably wasn't very it wasn't working because contraception was illegal,
Oh,
abortion.
well, actually, I mean, I looked into this once because somebody I was arguing with somebody like whether China could actually work. Like, do we have examples? So I looked into the Romania case, and it's funny. You look at the TFR; it was like there was one year where it's like that, but then Romania actually stays higher than all of Eastern Europe until like the 80s. So you got I think like 2 decades of higher birth rate. So in the not saying, not endorsing that policy. I mean, there was a lot that went into it, but the question of can it work? It actually can work. If your government is willing to do certain things, and I think modern China is like a lot more competent than Romania was in the 19. When did it start? Was it the 60s or the 70s?
I think it was like late 60s up to like
Yeah.
the end of the 80s. Yeah, like.
Right. So I mean, there is at least a historical example of a country having a pronatalist policy that worked and really worked in an extreme way.
It worked in an extreme way, but it's also like a kind of a scar in the history of the country. Like we still, remember
Yeah.
there were documentaries of orphanages in Romania,
Yeah.
that were just filled to the brim with these malnourished, untouched children that would look like in like an Affix Twin video. It was just like a terrible, yeah, a terrible situation. And these were kind of the children of the decree. We call them the decree,
Yeah.
children of the decree, and that was.
Yeah, you don't want to, you don't. You're a country that's at that point of history, you're that poor. You don't want to, have as many children as possible. People who can't take care of. Yeah, obviously that's a terrible policy. Hopefully, in a wealthier, more advanced society, you would have, a smarter, more focused policy.
Yeah, yeah, because the policy was essentially no abortions, no contraception. I think you could have elective abortions after you had 4 children. Uh,
Yeah.
you could get some form of contraception. I'm not exactly sure what the parameters.
Well, what else was there besides no abortion, no kind of was there something, no
A lot
contraception?
of it
Was
was
there more?
enforcing, like very violent enforcing of this very particular.
How would they force? They would just what would they
They would
do?
send the doctors that were found to be performing, back alley abortions or something directly to prison.
Right.
But with
But
like
was that it? Was it just banning abortion and punishing people who have abortions, or was there something more?
people who had abortions, people who performed abortions, and the fact that the actual commerce, the black market was really limited in Romania. So it was very hard to get things from outside because the guns were pointing inward. The borders were pretty not very permeable compared to other countries in the area. So it really wasn't anyway. Locally, we weren't producing any of these things. There wasn't no one's making
Mm,
a pill in Romania. So
yeah.
yeah, there was yeah.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because there are some countries in East Asia where not a lot of women are on birth control and not a lot of people have abortions. I think Korea is like this, and still they have pretty low birth rates. So yeah, it's interesting that that's enough.
With the risk of making this a pretty weird podcast, I've heard that the pull-out method is actually extremely successful. So
Yeah. Well, why didn't Romanians do that then?
I don't know.
They
Apparently,
didn't
maybe
discover
they didn't know about it.
it.
They weren't convinced of its success, so they were like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, this is off brand. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, there's another kind of layer to this, and I'm curious what your angle is on this. Is a falling birth rate actually something that countries should be concerned with?
I mean, I think so. I think more people is good. I mean, if you're utilitarian, I mean, like not in every situation, more people are good. Sometimes people have miserable circumstances. But look, if you're a first world person who's going to live a first world life, yeah, I mean, it's better to be alive uh, than not be alive. It has, implications for society. I think a lot of these, I think a lot of that craziness is by childless people, particularly childless women, and they have some kind of emptiness in their life, and they're trying to replace it with something else. So it's better for society. I think people. You ask anyone who's had kids, and it's so funny because you like I've noticed it in like portrayals like Hollywood portrayals. If you watch something like like Mad Men or something, it's always got sort of this message that like the people who had children were always like worse off because they had children. And, like whatever else they would have been doing was so much cooler. And I don't think if you talk to most parents, regret is the main emotion or anywhere close to it. I think most will say it's made their life better. We worry about the characteristics of future generations, and there's smart people stop having kids. What's gonna happen to people's intelligence. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, what kind of society we're gonna have depends on who has kids today. So yeah, there's a lot of good reasons uh, to worry about the birth rate. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that government, is certain to be able to do something about it, within reason. But along the edges and culturally, I mean, we should all be encouraging it.
Yeah. I think you're right. The Carlin hypothesis sounds like it's already kind of happening, and it will start to happen. There are also competing ideas as well. Like for example, city living is associated with low birth rates, and it has been since people were living in London, like in the 1200s or wherever there's been documented. City living for a long time, like the birth rates were significantly lower than in the countryside. So I think the more urbanization happens, the lower the birth rates tend to be. But I'm I don't know. I'm kind of hopeful given
Mm.
this the religious shall inherit the earth idea. And actually it doesn't necessarily have to be the religious, is essentially whoever wants to breed in a way. And I think it's kind of a more traditionalist movement. Some people are like ex rationalists like me.
Yeah.
So I think there are certain movements that aren't necessarily religious that are going to be making a dent.
Well, yeah, I mean, and those people, I mean, there's nothing more certain that than whoever is choosing to have kids, will have more kids, and those people's genes will get passed on, right? I mean, that is certain. Now, the rational ex rationalists and other people, probably there's not as much of them as religious fundamentalists who are having kids, and we don't notice those people as much. But one way or another, whoever wants kids is going to be having kids, and there's nothing more certain in sort of evolutionary theory or demographically you can imagine than that fact that this problem will eventually, the trend will eventually reverse.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk kind of tied into the sex select or the selective abortion question about um uh, kind of selecting embryos, or I'm not sure exactly what the technology is called, but it's essentially within the context of something like IVF. You would be able to pre-select embryos with a certain genetic makeup from a panel of available
Right.
embryos. This is very hot topic that and apparently China is much more advanced in this, or at least is going to be much more advanced because they don't really have any religious hangups with this technology, or at least they don't seem to have that. I don't know. Do you think that there are certain things in technology that are graspable, sound like a good idea, but that we still shouldn't do just because of a kind of a more a precautionary principle? It's like don't pull the switch on the singularity machine if you can help it. Or is
Yeah.
it essentially kind of like a global problem where it's essentially a game theoretic problem where if China is going to do it, you'd better be first.
Yeah, I used to think China was moving ahead with this, but actually, I think the trends are a little bit. I mean, they're more in tune with Western trends and Western ideas of ethics than people think. So there was one scientist who created, I think, the first baby with DNA from three different people, and they actually put him in jail after there was sort of a backlash in the West. So actually, I think the U.S. probably is less regulated on this stuff than China is. Yeah, embryo selection is not really about birth rates for the most part because it's about which child you'll have. So the GWAS, the genome wide association studies, they're getting better, so you can predict a little bit more than you could in the past about and sometimes diseases are just binary. Like, does a person have one disorder that's determined by one gene, and sometimes it's a predictive thing, like, okay, this person has a slightly higher chance or a slightly lower chance of schizophrenia, or the higher chance of graduating college or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with these technologies. I mean, like AI, we're still basically, if you look at something like AI and like the singularity, and like that has like something, if we create something that can supplement its own intelligence, it becomes like a million times smarter than us, then there's unintended consequences. This is basically taking human variation, right, and just selecting from among that human variation. So I don't see the potential for it to go that badly. So I'm generally, in favor of these kind of technologies, and I don't think you need government to do anything. I think people will generally want to use these technologies often. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I think the first response to this, kind of the knee jerk response, is that this is probably going to be a very expensive type of technology. Kind of a stratum of society will have access to this, and then they will select their children to be
They're
sued.
doing that. I mean, they're doing that now. So the sort of mating is getting higher and higher. So you're more likely to mate with someone who has similar education background. So that problem is already there. When things get, I mean, when technology, I mean, technology always starts out expensive and then gets cheaper, and we should be wanting to do that. So I mean, that would hold back pretty much any technology, because when it starts, it's always more expensive. But then hopefully you have innovation, and then more people can use it.
Yeah, but this type of technology sounds very visceral. It's like the makeup of your child. It sounds like something very. I mean, it is something very intimate and very very important, especially if you can slap on 30 IQ points to your child. It's
Well,
quite.
that's genetic engineering is, I mean, different. So, like, if you imagine, I mean, we're nowhere close to that, I think now, but yeah, it's different from embryos, like just selecting from, I mean, from different babies who are otherwise developing naturally. You're right. There's another step, but I don't have a problem with the the other genetic engineering stuff either. I think you'll get humans, you'll get variation. Like, not everyone just wants to max intelligence. Some people want to max looks, or they want to max, you know. Uh, work ethic or whatever. And so I think that would be cool. I don't think you'd lose the human diversity. I think you'd get actually a lot of diversity because people have different values.
Mhm. And I think in a way it's kind of debugging IVF, because as far as I understand, IVF is quite dysgenic at the moment. It's a hard it's there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems associated with children who come out of IVF. Yeah,
Is
there's
there? I didn't know that. Well, they tend to be older, right? I mean, the people who get IVF, right? Is it just that?
It's essentially you're kind of shocking into life an unviable pregnancy with
Mhm.
kind of random sampling of sperm, because you're not really selecting for the fastest swimmer. You're just kind of taking it out of a
Ah,
fish, and then you're injecting it into an egg in probably not the best conditions. Maybe the egg is a bit older,
interesting.
like you said. So there's obviously this is essentially the recipe. These people can't have viable pregnancies for whatever reason. So you go to the witch doctor and he does this thing, and then later down the line. I mean, I think don't quote me on this, but I think it's autism, ADHD, things like
Yeah.
that. Things
I
that.
didn't know. I didn't know the fastest sperm. I mean, yeah, I didn't know that. I'd like to learn more about that. Some of the stuff you're right is just being older, and that's going to have an effect. So I wonder how much is that, and how much of it is other things going on.
Yeah, I mean, being preterm, things like that. Just like more complex pregnancies, more tend to have more complexities, even when the kids get older. So
Uh,
it's just not the best situation, but it is a viable pregnancy, and that's essentially what they promise. Anyway, but if these the embryo selection could help with that, it essentially could make essentially IVF more viable, or at least maybe it could drag it to a baseline that it's just like more like a normal pregnancy.
mm.
Yeah, so you had a very interesting thread on on essentially fuck ups in Afghanistan, and they were very I don't know. It was one of those greatest hits of expert disaster. I'm curious, like, what do you think went wrong in Afghanistan? I mean, going to Afghanistan might have been the first thing that went wrong with Afghanistan, but what's your theory of why? Why was the why did the last what was it 20 years happen, and what were the factors that led to it?
I think America. I think there's a broader story here about American foreign policy, which is it's basically the ultimate form of fake expertise. I mean, you have this Pentagon, and it's something like it's something I think like 10 or 20% of the American federal budget, and it's just this big monster, right? And employs through contractors and directly through the military, millions of people, all this money that these companies, they have an interest. They start funding think tanks. They fund, activists and organizations that are always threat inflating. What they say is, China's a threat, Russia's a threat, Iran is a threat militarily, and so you have these people selected, these generals, they don't get in their position because they've won wars. I mean, the U.S. When's the last time the U.S. Won a war? It's been a pretty long time, and so they're political actors. Basically, they're working within the system. They're getting a lot of them, are pretty much all of them at the top now, according there's a Boston Globe article that showed this, get jobs in the weapons industry or some kind of consulting firm after they retire. Um, and so you have, I don't think people should just say it's Afghanistan. I think people need to be very skeptical of American foreign policy. I think they have to see it as a sort of form of fake expertise, a sort of a money making scam. The people believe in it, but the people who believe in it all have a stake in the system. So the U.S. went to Afghanistan. I mean, and you look at like every step of the way. I mean, there was no interest in negotiating with the Taliban. We just decided, like, what kind of. We didn't look at the country and talk to the people there or do anything. We just decided that this is the kind of government you should have. You should have a parliamentary system, and you should elect. Yeah, not a parliamentary system, presidential system. Actually, you should elect a president. You should have X number of women in your parliament. You should have girls' schools. The whole thing was never close to reality. I mean, the thing was basically we were trying to remake a society with and the resources weren't weren't equal to it, or the resources were just set by political constraints. But the mission always just what it was, because that's what the generals were saying, and that's what sort of the foreign policy establishment wanted. They always wanted to say that whatever you happen to be doing right now is realistic. So that I have a lot of good threads on this. I mean, it's comical. I mean, there's a book called "No Good Men Among the Living," and I have a Twitter thread on that. If people want to find my Substack, I have a Substack which is just Afghanistan content, and it includes the Twitter threads. I mean, there were these local rivalries, and the U.S. has no idea what's going on in this country. And someone says, my neighbor who I don't like is Taliban, and then they'd go like bomb, just go bomb the person's house, or they would raid the person's house, and it was just like this for 20 years, and then it collapses, and the government collapses, before the U.S. could even get out. So, I mean, what went wrong? I mean, everything went wrong. The mission wasn't realistic. I mean, people weren't in touch with reality. Nobody could actually say, what the U.S. What the ultimate goal was. You'd like to have some kind of stable democracy, but like when that was clear that wasn't going to happen. What did people want us to be there for forever? So yeah, I mean, it's just a disaster, and that's why in the New York Times piece, and then in the Tech Block on the Taliban Substack, I try to tell people, take this lesson, apply it more broadly. It's not just Afghanistan, it's U.S. foreign policy. It's a lot of expertise out there, which is just fake.
Yeah, and it feels like, once all of these things are in place, there is no mechanism to roll them back. Like, these agencies, these I have a feeling that, lockdown is a bit like that. I mean, I wrote a piece on this because it feels like there are all these mechanisms to build up this this phenomenon, and to make it available as a tool, but there's not really a mechanism to deflate these things. And I feel like foreign policy is probably one of the biggest, exponents of this problem. But almost anything that the government, puts its grubby hands on tends to have this dynamic where you just inflate, and there's no one really to,
Yeah.
gonna fire.
Well, yeah, look at the TSA. I mean, there was somebody attempted to blow up a shoe. They were stopped by passengers on the plane. But now we've had, the TSA wasn't that, so we take off our shoes for that. But the TSA was set up in response to 9/11, and whether this made sense to have this forever, or whether you could just sort of solve the, just by fortifying the cockpit door, not letting people in, you could have solved the problem that way. The fact that people won't let themselves, get hijacked anymore and flown into a building, right? So you have these, you have no cost benefit analysis, but the TSA is still there. Air travel gets worse and worse. Yeah, and there's a lot of things, when it comes to things where keeping people feel like they're unsafe. There's a ratchet effect, you're right, and often public opinion goes along with it. I mean, you pull people on lockdowns. I mean, it's scary. I mean, they're worse than the politicians. People blame the politicians. I think the people want more extreme measures than what the politicians are giving them. I think the politicians, if anything, have been a sort of I remember I'm in Southern California, and so even when they said you don't need masks anymore, if you've been vaccinated, people were, I was like, still 80% of people in the store, and even when the state government lifted the restrictions, 80% of people in the store were still wearing masks. People were still wearing masks outside. Nobody is saying, like Fauci or the CDC, or nobody is telling you you should wear masks outside of your vaccine, like, except in rare circumstances, they'll say that. But still, I see a lot of people putting children in masks outside, wearing masks outside. I think we are I think we've become a hysterical society, and whatever we're focusing on just becomes, all we think about. Like when terrorism was a big thing, all we ever thought about was terrorism, and no inconvenience was too great. Now it's COVID-19, and yeah, it's terrible. I mean, the direction we've gone with this, I would have never suspected for a threat that at this point, after the vaccinations, after all this time. This threat that is so small, we'd still accept so much inconvenience in our lives, especially for children and what we do to them in school. I mean, it's just really, really depressing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people are gaining a certain amount of meaning out of these rituals. Like it's there's not really a lot of religious observance in society anymore, but this seems like this uniting phenomenon where you are on the side of the people who are pro safety. They care about the children. They're going to protect us from this, from this miasma that's captured the land, that's killing your grandma, and they're the good people. And I feel like maybe it has like a psychological effect for a lot of people. People that are predisposed to this type of stuff, and most people I think are predisposed to not really understand, cost benefit analysis. It seems like it's a pretty exotic thing to think about cost benefit.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it reminds me. I mean, I go back to, again, the war on terror, just because there's so many parallels here. But in like the decade after 9/11, you would get these articles, usually in conservative media, but sometimes elsewhere, that, like, this is the struggle of our time. We're going to build, this is like World War II. We're going to, bring democracy to the Middle East, and none of it ever made any sense. I mean, you're going to go into Iraq because of 9/11. It just, there was just no connection to it, and you're going to build democracy and women's rights. And this has gone. I mean, the last 10 years, you don't see this. People are cynical about American foreign policy, but a lot of people did get meaning from this idea that there was this grand struggle against terrorism. There was this thing that was like, as strong as communism or Nazism, and we're, the West is going to pull together, and they're going to, solve, they're going to solve this problem, and they're going to win a war. I mean, so that we were primed for that. And I think, yeah, COVID is another kind of thing like that. People are, sort of, some people are just sort of yearning for a chance to show how superior they are, how much they're willing to sacrifice. Yeah, and it's a terrible thing. I mean, and they're forcing these beliefs on, they're the ultimate, these practices that are just crazy given any objective cost benefit analysis. They're forcing it on the rest of society.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me now, thinking about Afghanistan. This is the first time they've reacted negatively to a Biden policy, And the fact that it's been, the fact that it actually happened was quite surprising as well. But the fact that the media and Biden are for the first time not aligned, I wonder, why do you think the media is so is itching to stay in Afghanistan? Is it,
Yeah.
rural imperialism? Girls and women need to enforce trans rights.
Well, yeah, the media is, very left wing on most things, but they're very pro war, and a lot of the national security reporters are people who. They get where they are. They have access to the military, the national security bureaucracy. A lot of times they're reporting. They're basically stenographers. They'll say, five sources say that Russia is going to do this or China's going to do that. And so, yeah, there is this sort of imperialist mindset, right? That the U.S. is sort of doing great things in the world, and it has to keep doing those great things. You also have the partisanship of it. Like Republicans are more excited about attacking the Pentagon over Afghanistan than just about anything else because they're overwhelmingly still the pro-war party, and so you have the media and you have the Republicans together. That's a they're usually at loggerheads. I mean, that's a powerful combination. And Americans don't really care that much about foreign policy. So whoever's like yelling loudest can sort of make whoever's trying to pull back from anything, make them look bad or hurt their approval ratings. I think that's what happened to Biden. But you're right. I mean, it was a great feat of political courage, and that he did. I think in the end he'll be better off for it because otherwise you'd keep fighting the war for years and years. And you know what? If you did that, Republicans would have been attacking you for not ending the war that Trump wanted to end. So at least it's getting behind us, and people I don't think are going to remember Afghanistan or think about that indefinitely into the future.
Yeah, I agree. It's the only move left there, and it should have been done a long time ago. I wonder how much of our current arrangement do you think is technologically mediated? How much of it is because of the medium of the internet and how people tend to relate on it, and or also, for example, I think video is the fact that you can have instant video communication about random anecdotal events like sorry to say it, George Floyd, and that can spread like wildfire if you attach it to a narrative, and it could influence policy like at that
Yeah.
level. It seems to me like it's a killer app for any sort of crazy political movement you want to seed.
Yeah, no, unquestionably. So Zach Goldberg is that Great Awakening, starts around 2010, 2011. That's about, I don't think it's coincidental. It's about the time that Twitter really takes off. And Twitter is used a lot by journalists, academics, people who are influential in shaping public opinion. Yeah, you're right. I mean, sometimes you'll see these videos online and, they're on Twitter and they'll get like, all these retweets and, all these people watch it. And it'll say this black man was pulled over just for being black or something, and all you don't see that part happening. All you see is like him arguing with the police officer. You have no idea what happened before, and everyone will share this, right? Like it's just like the video proves whatever the text is saying. People like Sean King put that out there. So yeah, I think I think that there's the polarization and political divisions. I think that's traced to a more fragmented media landscape. In the U.S., we used to have three major networks: CBS, ABC, NBC. They'd cover news for a half hour a night, and then you'd have your newspaper, and that was it. I think talk radio, 24-hour news channels they had to fill up airtime, and then they went into opinion programming. I think that really split the country apart. I think it made us crazier. And then the internet is just an accelerant, right? It's just further fragmentation. So yeah, I think this is particularly bad in the U.S. Now, what a lot of European countries do is they just have censorship. I mean, they just have censorship in Germany, in Germany and France, and so you can't have that much division if you restrict the space of what you're allowed to say. We don't have that in the U.S., so we have that fragmentation. Plus, we have the size and diversity of the country. Plus, we have the First Amendment. I think it's a recipe to just have this there's just to have this very polarized politics and just these moral hysterias, and these people being afraid of these different things. And we go through these sort of cycles. So I noticed that like George Floyd, the police shooting was going on at one time. Like Me Too calms down during that. right? And that goes away, and then Me Too comes back, and then we have COVID, which knocks it off the front page. People said wokeness is gone. I knew wokeness would still be there. It just needed a while, right? You just needed to go through the cycle because you can't pay attention to everything. And terrorism was like this, but like the only right wing version uh, of this. And yeah, it's a recurring problem. Why I'm not particularly optimistic about American politics.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like something that's very hard to roll back. It's one of those things. Like once you have the magic thing in your pocket, it becomes indispensable in so many ways. Like for example, now a lot of the kind of government COVID stuff, you get it for your phone.
Yeah.
Everything's in I don't know, weird codes that you get for everything. It's definitely a hard thing to put down. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm one of the worst offenders. I've got
Yeah.
children.
Same here. Yeah. I'm not putting it down either.
Yeah, which you shouldn't do, children. Yeah, I want to wrap this up by asking you the question of the show. I have a question of the show.
Mm.
It is, do you have someone, a subversive thinker that you think people should read more of, or listen more to, or it could be anyone alive or dead, writer, politician, whoever you think is, someone who probably influenced you. That should be more better understood by other people.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Anatoly Karlin. I think he's a really smart guy. Let me see who else is sort of a subversive thinker. Um, it's too like easy to say Steve Saylor. I mean, everyone I think reads Steve Saylor, so it's sort of such an obvious. Uh,
He hasn't
uh,
been mentioned yet, so if anyone does not know about Steve
Well,
Sill.
they're afraid to. They're afraid to. I'm not afraid. That's the difference. I think Ann Coulter is very underrated. She retweets me a lot, but if you just put her in with the other right wing sort of bomb throwers, and she's not like obscure or anything. I mean, she's very famous, obviously. But if you just put her in with like these other like right wing sort of media personalities, you'll miss something because she's actually smart. She knows the facts, and she's provocative, but she's very good on things like crime and things like that. Um, yeah, like there's some leftists who are like, if you want to woke someone to follow who's woke, I like Michelle Goldberg from the New York Times, Jeet Heer from the New Republic. These they're woke and they're going to be as woke as you expect. But I think that sometimes the woke people do have smart critiques of Republicans and the right. And so often the people who'll be most right about a movement are its worst critics. I mean, that's usually true for both sides. So yeah, I mean, I recommend. It's a cliche, but I recommend some intellectual diversity, but not just for the sake of it, but just because some people are going to be crazy on one thing, but will actually be insightful on other things, and you should try to get what you can from different sources.
Yeah, if you can stomach it. Because I think that's why people don't really have such a varied,
You should be able to. You should not let it get to you. You should be able to read stuff that's really, really stupid and just deal with it. I mean, that's my recommendation to everybody.
yeah, yeah, I think that's a very good recommendation, and it's a very good place to wrap on, and I thank you very much, Richard. I wanna point people towards your excellent Substack, which is, Hanania at Substack, or
Just richardhanania.substack.com. I'm not, original with the naming.
okay, perfect. Well, yeah, it's the best. That's where people can find you, and also the CSPI Center. Not sure if there's publications coming out, but people can follow you on Twitter on that
Yeah,
account.
we have good publications and out, and we do have publications coming. You can find us on Twitter too, and you can find what we've written before.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Richard. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This was fun.